So, I want to kick off, but I want to tell you a little bit about Stuart Coupe first. Some of you may know him well, but I want to give you the full rundown on Stuart before we dive in. When you think about the Australian music scene and music writing in general, Stuart Coupe is who comes to mind. Journalist, author, editor, manager, record label director, radio presenter, publicist, tour promoter, and music lover. He's been a manager for the Hoodoo Gurus and Paul Kelly. He's promoted and toured artists from overseas, including Harry Dean Stanton, Chris Whitley, Roseanne Cash, Lucinda Williams. He has done publicity for The Clash, for the Dead Kennedys, for the Cramps. He founded fanzines, magazines, and new TV shows about the music scenes. Then there are the people he's interviewed over the years, everyone from Bruce Springsteen to Leonard Cohen, Brian Wilson to Mick Jagger, Joni Mitchell to Jeff Buckley, and then with a little bit of Tiny Tim and Neil Diamond thrown in for good measure. He's written extraordinarily great books, including Roadies, The Promoters, Gudinski, the Godfather of Australian Rock and Roll, The New Rock and Roll, and so many others, as well as co-writing with others. Tonight we're going to talk about his latest, Shake Some Action, which is a memoir of sorts, chronicling a life in music, the exhilaration of working with some of the most incredible musicians of the last 50 years, and also the challenges of that, financially, personally, drug addiction, mental health issues, and what an obsession can do to other parts of your life. It is a ripper of a book, and he brings it all into vivid detail. Please join me in making Stuart Coupe very welcome.
Thank you. Can you just keep talking like that?
Yeah. I'm going to follow him around and do that.
That's sounding pretty good, Michaela.
Yeah. Stuart, I want to start at the beginning. You grew up in Launceston. You're born in 1956. What did music offer you? What do you think you loved about it so much as a child?
I honestly can't pinpoint, and I thought about it a lot writing this book, why the obsession. I just fell in love with it. Some of my earliest memories are sitting in my parents' bedroom with some people here are old enough to remember what crystal radios were, which connected to a phone, and I could hear Chris Winter on Room to Move on the ABC. I listened to 70X, which was the radical Launceston station of the time, 7LA, which was the more conservative station, read both conservative. And I just fell under the spell of music. I remember as a kid hearing a lot of Motown, hearing Jimi Hendrix, hearing, The Who I loved. And the first song that really got me was Friday on My Mind by the Easy Beats. And it was interesting, I heard it the other day. I was doing a radio interview in Melbourne and it was played and I still got goosebumps. Involuntary, I felt my arms just coming to life and I thought, God, I've heard this song thousands of times. But the first time I had $1.05, which I saved up from doing paper rounds in my local area, I went off to the white goods store in Launceston called Jessop's, and they had a little record bar down the back, and I bought Friday on My Mind, which I still have. And that was sort of the beginning. I started buying a lot of records. I played a lot of squash. I used to work at the local squash centre and I'd get paid $20 or $30 for a day, and then I'd go straight down to then Wills & Co., which was the local record shop. And I read a lot about music. I particularly read the work of Rob Smythe, who I give a whole chapter to. He was the music reviewer for Nation Review. And I probably had this sort of emerging but pretty basic political consciousness, so I didn't really understand a lot about what was in Nation Review. Yeah, ALP was good, everyone else was bad. It was a bad at one point I was persuaded to join the anarchist party in Launceston, but that's another story.
Actually, I want to jump in with another question.
Yes,
you say something early on in the book which really just jumped out at me. The book's fantastic. You say there's no such thing as bad music. There's no such thing as bad music, only what moves you and what doesn't. And I wanted you to unpack that a bit for us. Like, what goes into that? How do you work out what moves you? How did you work out what moves you? You talked about Motown and other things that you heard, but that's quite a big call.
Yes, I mean, I went through a period of, early 20s brash arrogance where I did think that there was good music and bad music. And my thinking about music and the role it plays in people's lives has changed. to the point where I actually do think, unless it's really, really terrible, but even terrible rudimentary music can have a certain beauty to it and can move people. So I've shied away over the years from going, that's bad, this is good. It's just, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. And what works for me, it's partly the hairs on my arm and the feeling I get when I'm listening to music. It's sometimes how it reflects and defines what's going on in my life. And sometimes songs will come to me, often years after I first heard them. And they will figure in some way in my existence at the time. But it's a palpable physical response to particular songs. It's singing along to them really, really badly, and I can do really, really badly, really, really well. And my partner will attest to that. And it's, it is very hard. It's a very emotional, it's a gut-felt response. It's hearing a particular song and going, wow, where did that come from? How did somebody create that? That's talking to me. And sometimes a song that talked to me when I was 25 doesn't talk to me as a 66-year-old, but sometimes, songs that I dismissed in my comparative youth, now speak to me because I've changed. Those songs haven't changed, but I'm a different person and my interaction with music is different. Yeah. But it's a thrill factor too. One of my favourite things is when I'm lucky enough to be side stage watching a big show, and nothing ever stops giving me absolute chills at that moment when you're at it can be a small show, but usually it's a bigger show. When the audience hushes, then they start cheering, house lights go down. There is this amazing couple of minutes when it's darkness. And I love being, I'm lucky enough occasionally to be backstage. You start seeing torches. It's a bit like Spinal Tap, but good Spinal Tap. and people making their way towards the stage. And then suddenly there's this roar and the beginning of a show. And I've never failed to be anything other than absolutely moved by that experience. So, it comes in different ways.
We're going to dive in a moment to talk about what led you to writing and then to promoting and touring and everything else you've done as well. But you describe being a bit of a loner as a child, being pretty solo a lot of the time and not having a lot of friends, especially when you were growing up in Tasmania. Do you think that maybe that experience has maybe shaped the level of obsession you have for music? Because you are an obsessive. I mean, you're that way about. You're that way about books as well. You detail, loving crime fiction, but the level of collecting, the level of kind of the depth of interest that you have. I mean, there are music lovers, and then there's a whole other category of which you are part of that.
And then there's people like me.
Do you think that solo experience is that maybe you didn't have anyone to share it with?
Yes, that's a good point. And I had a couple of friends, David Woodhall, who I referenced, who turned me on to the Velvet Underground. But, maybe it was that wanting to share what I loved about music. And you're right, not having a lot of people to do that with and not having, a close-knit group of other nerds. I was the only person thinking about those Leonard Cohen records and what they meant. I probably would have benefited from having someone else to talk about songs of love and hate with. But that desire to share and communicate and maybe, have these non-specific friends who I could write for and about has been a driving thing over the last 50 years. It's always been about, can we have a chat? And maybe it does go back to, the lonely little kid in Launceston going, I want some more people to talk about records with. But that's definitely what has shaped all of my writing. It's about, let's have a conversation, about saying, I love this music. I find something emotionally engaging with it. I'd like to think that maybe you would too. Can we sit down and have a chat about it?
That's kind of like at the heart of all your writing. And you got into writing really young, and you spent lots of years, honing it. And you say in the book, he's pretty honest about the fact that it took him a while to get good at it. But there were writers who inspired you. You mentioned, Nick Kent, but also Dave Marsh, Lester Bangs, and Rob Smith, who you've just mentioned as well, Smythe. What did you love about them? What did their writing show you was possible when it came to writing about something that can be as amorphous as music?
Because they wrote as fans. And they talked to me. And so that was really... And they introduced me to music. They wrote in a way that wasn't trying to say they were smarter than me, or that they necessarily, if they, they obviously knew more than me, but they weren't parading that they knew more than me. They were what I wanted to be like, the person who just explained in fairly straightforward language that passion and excitement. So I read all of those people, particularly Rob Smythe early on. When Nation Review came out on a Thursday, he would write, and also Rob Smythe taught me about loving a huge array of music. He'd write about Jimmy Buffett, Keith Jarrett, Alan Stivell, the Celtic harp player, the band, the Loving Spoonful, anything that moved him. And subsequently, I've said many, many times that I believe there's nothing wrong with loving ABBA and Hank Williams at the same time. Yeah. And I do. And quite often I will play ABBA and Hank Williams in the same day with equal enjoyment and love for both. I started writing. Plagiarism is the word they use these days for my attempts at taking inspiration from Rob Smythe. And I started a school magazine when I was 14, thanks to a science teacher I had who encouraged me. It was called Labyrinth. The cover is in the book. There was only one issue. And we had the school news and we had the sporting results, but basically it was the excuse for young Stuart, aspiring rock writer, to write a very long piece about the Loving Spoonful, in which I probably changed at least a dozen words from the piece Rob Smythe had written about the Loving Spoonful. And I still love the Loving Spoonful. So as I grew and read more, I weaned myself off imitation and slowly over a decade or so found some degree of a voice, and I'd like to think that has kept evolving over the 50 years. But yeah, it was practicing. I was just trying to write. I mean, at the time, I wanted to be good enough to write for the Launceston Examiner. I wanted the head of Chris Coupe. He was the music writer for the Examiner. I wanted his job.
I like it. I like the ambition early on.
I was out for Chris Coupe.
I want to get, later on we're going to get to interviewing, because Stuart's, and it struck me in the book that he's interviewed extraordinarily talented people, and all of the interview processes sound painful one way or another. And I think we need to hear from Stuart in the kind of the masterclass. But I wanted to ask you first about interviewing people you adore. You're a huge self-confessed Bruce Springsteen fan. And the book kind of opens with a great story about talking to him. I wanted to ask you, I guess, first off, what it is about his music that you love kind of almost more than anything else. I know you love a lot. You love jazz. You love, really widely. But also how you go about interviewing someone and not falling into that pit of fandom.
Occasionally I've fallen into that pit of fandom, and it hasn't turned out so well. We'll talk about Bob Dylan in a minute. But in the case of Bruce Springsteen, I do adore Springsteen. Not everything that Springsteen has released over the years, but the school teacher who encouraged me to start the magazine when I was 14 came back from London with Greetings from Ashbury Park, New Jersey, which was Bruce Springsteen's first album. And also I think I heard it on Room to Move with Chris Winter. He was a big influence on me, just radio still. And he was touted as the new Dylan, as was John Prine and Lurden Wainwright and a whole bunch of people at the time. But I went for Springsteen. It just, it was classically romantic. It was, clearly he had a love for old soul records and R&B records and things that I was kind of going, wow, I mean, I loved Motown. I still love, soul music as much as anything. And so when the interesting thing with Springsteen, and the book does start with me being this sounds horribly pretentious, but been backstage with Bruce, as you do, in Paris at 3 o'clock in the morning in 1981.
That's where I was in 1981, frankly.
Yeah, well, first time overseas too. And it was interesting because writing this book, I had cause to reflect that there was a 9-year gap between hearing this first Bruce Springsteen record and I was a kid who was sitting in Launceston dreaming of doing all this stuff. You know, jokes aside, I did think there was life beyond the Examiner. And I wasn't sure where it was, but it was, you know, there was something else. And so, you know, 9 years had passed with me just sitting, you know, in complete admiration of this record, thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to be someone who wrote about music and have somewhere to write about Bruce Springsteen. And so I ended up sitting with him in Paris. And guess what we talked about? Friday on My Mind by the goddamn Easy Beats. Because I asked him if there was any song that he'd most like to have played by an Australian band. And he didn't miss a beat. He said, Friday on My Mind by the Easy Beats. And I said, why don't you? And he said, it's too hard. And I'm thinking to myself, you're a great songwriter. You're also one of the best lead guitar players on the planet. It cannot be that complicated. So I came back to Australia, asked musician friends. I said, Friday on My Mind, simple, right? Straightforward pop song. Great pop song. They said, Stuart, you know nothing about music. They said, it's really, really, really complicated. And 40 years later, Bruce Springsteen came, last time he was in Australia with the E Street Band, Sydney show, what do you open with? Friday on My Mind. Abject lesson to us all. 40 years, you can get there. But obsessive fandom, if you want me to go Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
I interviewed Bob Dylan the first time in 1986 in New Zealand. I was given no warning. I was just told by Michael Gudinski that I was driving back to the hotel with him that night. I said, why? He said, you're interviewing Dylan. And I went back to the hotel, made... Big mistake, if you're ever going to interview Bob Dylan, never hoover half of Bolivia in the 2 hours before the interview. It's not advisable. So I was as high as 17 kites by the time I got to interview Bob Dylan. And I'd always tried with interviews, and I still do, to let an artist know that I know something about them and that I'm sympathetic, empathetic, you know, that I'm not just walking in having read the press release, that I've listened to maybe their early records or I've, you know, something or other, just to try and ease them into a conversation. That's a big mistake with Dylan. So I started talking to him about Lenny Bruce. He didn't want to talk about Lenny Bruce. Started talking to him about Allen Ginsberg. He didn't want to talk about Allen Ginsberg. He didn't basically want to talk about anything that I wanted to talk about. And I realised in hindsight that he really despises intense fans, nerdy fans.
Yeah.
I was a nerdy fan. And so he toyed with me. And whereas the second time I interviewed him in 1992 was only on the phone, but I learnt my lesson. I came across, I just didn't give a shit, Bob. You know, I didn't care. And I was cool, calm, and standard journalism practice. And he ended up talking about all of the things that I'd hoped he would have talked about in 1986 when I was being the obsessive music fan. You know, he told me about the poetry that he was rereading. He told me about recording with the band in the 60s. He asked me if I knew Brett Whiteley and talked about Brett Whiteley's artwork and all that sort of stuff, which, you know, was kind of like the dream interview, but it came about in this instance because I didn't come on as the train spotting, you know, tell me about the B-side of this song and all that, which I...
But as you say, that's something you could only have known after many, many years of doing interviews. You had a very different experience while we're doing some war stories. So you had a very different experience interviewing Leonard Cohen. Tell us about that. That was in Sydney, wasn't it?
That was in Sydney must have been 1981, I think. And I was a huge Leonard Cohen fan, still am. And Songs of Love and Hate was one of the very first records I ever heard. And so I was doing an interview with him at the Hilton Hotel in the city, and we were in the cafe. And it was a good interview. You know, he was supremely dapper, everything you would imagine Leonard Cohen to be. Very stylish, very cool, very friendly. And the conversation was going well. And at one point he turned over the placemat where he was having coffee and he started sketching. Took a pen out of his lapel. Of course, Leonard Cohen had a pen in his lapel. And I'm going, what's he doing? You know, he's sketching. And he kept looking up at me, and then he was sort of multitasking. He was answering my questions at the same time and sketching. And then eventually I realised he was sketching me. And because he was particularly taken by, I was leaning on the table and there was something about the placement of my fingers as I was holding my chin.
Yeah.
So he was trying to get, you know, my fingers in my face. So he sketched away, and then we finished the interview, and I said, Leonard, can I have that? And he said, no, it's mine. I said, Leonard, it's my face. And he gave it to me. And like an idiot, I didn't go straight to a framer's. I just put it with a whole bunch of ephemera around the place. The 80s, we moved every 3 days. And somewhere, maybe on somebody's wall, is a sketch of my face and my fingers done by Leonard Cohen. If you see it, I'd love to get it back. If you've got it, can we talk?
I want to jump back into promoting and working on tours, as you did for many years. You've promoted a heap of solo artists and bands from Australia and from overseas, and the stories you detail throughout the book show just how hard it is and how much can go wrong from gig to gig, and how much kind of magic and kismet there is. And I wanted to ask you, it's a big question, and maybe you can give us some examples to illustrate it. Why is it that some bands make it big and some bands don't?
Time and place, quality of songs, and whether they're, you know, reading the zeitgeist and what's going on at a particular time. An enormous amount of luck. You know, we forget how much luck plays. You know, at the time that I was managing Paul Kelly, you know, we had luck. We had a not bad pop song in Before Too Long, and we had a hell of a lot of luck that it got picked up by the radio at the same time as other equally worthy bands, and I think of the Go-Betweens and so forth,
yeah,
who didn't have that luck. And they didn't get picked up by Triple M, and their career didn't, you know, have the same escalation. But, you know, it's that strange confluence of, as I said, time and place. It's sometimes it comes down to attitude of the artist, how they engage with their fan base, you know, what they're like as live performers, what they're like as human beings. But you know, I mean, that's what makes it so endlessly fascinating, because there's always someone coming through. There's always someone who suddenly you haven't heard of, and then they're making this amazing music, and people are just going, wow, where have they been all my life? I need this music in my life. And you know, the music business is self-perpetuating. You know, it keeps on going. You know, there are, you know, hundreds of thousands of bands who don't make it. You know, there was a famous statistic that said, you know, it quoted how many records were released every year globally, and it was some astronomical number, and the figure was, you know, that something like 85 of them recouped the money spent on them. And the person pointed out that in the same year, you know, 103 people died from lightning strikes. You know, just to give a bit of perspective on it. But, you know, look, you know, it's probably one of the reasons that I'm still doing it, you know, that I'm still in love with music, because I still don't kind of understand. You know, I don't get why at a particular point in time, you know, some new band from Melbourne or from, you know, Detroit will just completely transform my life, and they will explode. And then, you know, you're hearing all these other bands that you go, they're as good as they are, you know, and they don't. And the bands that inspire other bands, you know, what do they say about the Velvet Underground? The first album only sold 500 copies, but every person who bought that record went and formed a band. Yeah. You know, and a lot of times, you know, artists' time comes, you know, way past when they would like it. and it can be, 10 years later that influence is felt. And that's with a lot of hip-hop and rap records that are sampling, fantastic old funk and soul records that just disappeared without trace at the time. And those artists are probably going, well, I wish that was happening now, But, so a very good question, not such a good answer. I don't know.
No, but also when you read the book as well, you'll see, you detail all of these tours that you took people on, and also as you say, you just kept falling in love with acts and going, well, we've got to tour them. And you said you used to write budgets down on the back of an envelope. There wasn't, but at the same time, even if you'd done spreadsheet after spreadsheet, you were still describing a kind of an X factor, a magic factor that you could never account for about why a tour in Canberra would go well and then the dates in Adelaide no one would show up, or vice versa, Melbourne and Sydney.
Look, tour promoting. Probably one of the things I'm most proud of, and one of the biggest mistakes I made, was that I only toured people I loved. I was on a mission to bring these people to Australia. So that was my motivation. I still don't know anything about budgeting. We literally would do budgets for tours that, we had no money, my partners and I, literally no money. And we're sometimes risking $150,000, and I'm scribbling literally on the back of an envelope going, okay, international air tickets, 5 times 2,000, that'd be 10 grand, accommodation, 8 times $100 a night, and all of that sort of stuff. And I remember when I made more money when I wrote a book about concert promoting than I ever did from promoting tours. And one of the first interviews I did for that book was with Michael Koppel, who was really successful at it and still is. And Michael, he pinpointed my mistake because he said, you started out doing what I did, only touring people you liked. And he said, I worked out reasonably quickly that it was cheaper to buy a first-class ticket to wherever they lived around the world, hire a limousine, and go and see them play 5 times.
Wow.
He had a good point.
There's a wonderful, the book is, peppered with these fantastic stories. You described sitting backstage with Paul McGuinness, who was U2's band manager. Tell us about that story, because that was sort of in the midst of when you were trying to sort of really get the touring and promoting work off the ground.
Yeah, that conversation with Paul McGuinness changed my life, and it fuels everything that I do these days. If a young artist calls me up and they want to know something, or someone wants to know something about writing or radio, I go, you know what, I got an hour, come on over, let's have a chat, or let's have a Zoom, because Paul McGuinness was the manager of U2, biggest band on the planet at the time. I still can't remember why I was backstage. I remember Bono coming in. I used to have my photo in a caricature of me in the Sun Herald. I remember Bono walking in. He goes, Stuart, you look so much better in the flesh than you do in that silly newspaper photo. And I ended up talking to Paul McGuinness, and I told him that I was managing this band called the Hoodoo Gurus, and we had a #1 college radio record, which is a big deal at the time, in America, and we were about to embark on a tour. And, we ended up doing 42 shows in 44 days in America. Started in Los Angeles, went to Santa Barbara, cut through up to Chicago, down Boston, into New York, turn around and come back. And Paul said, sit down. And you two were on stage. And he said, sit here with me. And he said, get some paper and a pen. And, manager of the biggest band in the world, right? Me, nobody. Guy just learning what managers did. And he said, when you get to LA, you're going to need to speak to this booking agent. You'll want to speak to this publicist. If you need PA equipment, you'll need to speak to this person. When you get to New York, you'll need to, this is Barry Ball, he's our booking agent. He's the guy you're going to need to talk to. You'll want to talk to this person who maybe do this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm scribbling down telephone numbers and bits of paper and envelopes. And at one point I said to him, Paul, this is all fantastic, but I said, these people will have no idea who I am. And he said, and I said, I'll probably get the secretary's secretary when I ring them. And he said, no, you'll be fine. I said, why? He said, I will have called them all before you get there. And it makes me emotional now.
I got there and he'd brung everybody. And
It's an extraordinary act of generosity.
and I thought, that's incredible, that you would do that. And that was in the early 1980s. And literally everybody I called, they said, Paul called us, come on in. When do you want to come and have a meeting? And that really was life-changing for me. Because, the music industry is so much about knowledge being power. And I've always railed against that. That shouldn't be the structure and how things work. And I was lucky, not only with Paul McGuinness, but, and that one encounter. But, I had people like Michael Gudinski and, Gary Ashley, Michael Chugg, and people who also railed against that. They were powerful figures, but they used that power, but they also were prepared to share it with a young kid like, me, who was learning the ropes and letting me know, let me know how things happen. And that happened with writing too, particularly Anthony O'Grady at Ram magazine, who, I credit with teaching me how to write. And it was that generosity of spirit that, is so incredibly important, and the reason that I'm sitting here now because of a lot of those people.
When it comes to writing, did you always feel like you had a lot of freedom to write? Because there were moments where you were, Packer took over one of the magazines you were working for, you had some, some Murdoch interference at some point, and you talk a lot in the book about this movement from music journalism to becoming sort of paid advertorials. And I wonder if you could talk about how you managed that kind of conflict.
That's probably when I cut out from, a lot of that day-to-day journalism. I look back on my time, and it still staggers me, at the Sun Herald. I moved from Ram magazine to the Sun Herald in 1979 and wrote the music column for that newspaper for 10 years, occasionally sharing it with people. But, I had half a page every week in the Sun Herald, which it's kind of hard to imagine now, but the Sun Herald at the time was the biggest selling newspaper in the country, and it was a hard-hitting, investigative, take no prisoners newspaper. And so I had a half page in the biggest selling paper in the country, and no one in 10 years ever tapped me on the shoulder. I wrote about independent Australian and international music every week for the biggest selling paper in the country. No one ever came up and said, "Hey, Stuart, you know that Elton John guy, he's got a new record out. Do you think you should write about that?" No one said, "Oh, Rod Stewart's touring. Should we be covering the Rod Stewart tour?" They just let me write about Tactics and the Sacred Cowboys and the Particles and the Laughing Clowns.
Amen.
And, I headed into the big league, wrote about Nick Cave.
And no one ever said, when you do the interview, we want to read it before you publish it?
No, the only person who ever said that was, this is actually, it's my Paul McCartney story. Okay. I've never interviewed a Beatle. I've interviewed Yoko, and that was good fun. But in the 80s, we were offered at the Sun Herald an interview with Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney's people said they wanted veto. That's the only time. There was a period when record companies used to try and get you to sign documents about what you would do with the interview, and we just put the piece of paper in the corner and did the interview and walked out. But I think Mick Jagger's people tried that. Give me a break. But Paul McCartney's people said, they wanted veto after I'd done the interview of what I wrote about Sir Paul. And I went to the magnificent Tony Stevens, who was editor of the Sun Herald at the time, and I said, "Tony, we've got a McCartney interview, but they want veto." And he said, "We can't do that." And I said, "I'm with you." And so he wrote back to McCartney's people and said, "Look, thank you for the offer, but we can't agree to your request for veto of the story." And he wrote, "Even the Australian Prime Minister doesn't make such demands upon our newspaper." The most brilliant response came back from McCartney's people. It went, "Prime Ministers come and go. There is only one Paul McCartney." No. It was. Look, what could you say? It was masterful.
It really was. So good. I wanted to stay on writing for one more moment when it comes to reviewing. I mean, you hit a point in your career, and we can't possibly cover it tonight because there's so much of it, where you had not one and then you had a second record label, you were promoting bands, you were sometimes writing about bands that you were kind of producing. How did you manage those conflicts of interest when it came to reviewing things and those kinds of things and still keep your integrity? Because I think there are two big things that run all the way through the book. One is your absolute love of music, but also is your integrity. You know, you wouldn't be paid off. You didn't seem to fawn over people. You didn't write something because someone was nice to you. You wrote about the things that moved you, and you called Duran Duran Yawn Yawn when you didn't really like them, you know?
I like them a bit more now. Not hugely, but you know, we have a slightly more easy relationship. But that's a good question. Look, occasionally I skirted close to the wire on, just very occasionally, and I still have to think about it. You know, I do independent publicity, and you know, and I quite often want to play artists that I work with on the radio, and I have to make a. You know, at FBI, for instance, at 2SER, we have a kind of unstated rule that we can play one thing that we're involved with per show.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm kind of comfortable with that. Look, the biggest dilemmas I had, I don't think I ever wrote about anyone on Green Records. And I certainly didn't write about anyone on Laughing Outlaw. I did write about the Hoodoo Gurus and Paul Kelly, and reluctantly. But my justification, and people might say no, was that I thought, well, I do have these incredible outlets, you know, the Sun Herald and Dolly, and at that point, both the Hoodoo Gurus and Paul Kelly had ascended to a level where if I wasn't writing those columns, they would have been written about. And I'm going, okay, out of 52 columns I write for the Sun Herald, if I do one on the Hoodoo Gurus and one on Paul Kelly, I'm kind of okay with that. Yeah. Yes, it's a conflict of interest in some respect. I remember that one of my first shifts at FBI, and I was doing a late night radio show called Lyricism, which is how I started. And one night I thought, oh God, will I play a Jason Walker song? And it was on my label. And I went, you know what, I really love Jason Walker's record. You know, in a 3-hour show, I'm going to play one song involved with my record label. So at about 12 o'clock, midnight, I put on a Jason Walker song. The phone in the studio rang immediately. There was a male voice, I picked it up, said hello. A male voice said, fucking conflict of interest, and hung up the phone. Took a while before I played anything on Laughing Outlaw on the show. Yeah. So, you know, what it did was remind me that, you know, look, you know, these are important issues. I've never felt that I have abused that thing.
Yeah.
You know? But yes, occasionally I would write things, and you know, you try it, and if you're going to play something, you say, you know, I'm helping them out with publicity, or I'm doing, you know, I'm the manager. So, yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned Paul Kelly, and I think we can't, you know, I do want to ask you at least one question about him, because there was a sort of a small coterie of people, I didn't know this about Paul Kelly, who really fought hard when he wanted to release a double album and sell it for the price of one album, when he wanted to record an acoustic album, and you were a big part of that, of supporting him. And I guess I wanted to ask, when you first heard him, you know, what did you feel and what did you think? Did you have a sense straight away of what he could be?
No, but I thought he was pretty good. Paul was the first interview I ever attempted to do, and I use the word attempted deliberately because he didn't say anything. I was a big fan of his band, the High Rise Bombers. He'd left Adelaide was living in Melbourne. I'd moved from Launceston to Adelaide to go to university, and I really wanted to meet Martin Armiger. Right, because I thought Martin was kind of pretty cool, and he interested me a lot. You know, the late Martin Armiger, and so I arranged to do an interview with the High Rise Bombers so that I could meet Martin Armiger.
Fair call.
And Paul Kelly, who was the singer in that band, came along, and he didn't say anything. And when I was writing the book about him, I said, you didn't say anything when I tried to interview you the first time. He said, no, that was my trip back to Adelaide where I didn't talk to anybody.
Right. Subsequently, I did teach him a little bit about how to do interviews when I was his manager. But I kind of like that Lou Reed meets Bob Dylan meets television, meets all of that stuff that I loved that was... it was sort of there on those first couple of records. I love Manila, the second record that he released, and I wrote, back when you could write a record review in RAM that ran the entire page and was probably about 2,000 words about how great this record was. And so, I grew to love Paul. We had that uneasy friendship that journalists and artists do. It's a little bit of mutually needing each other. It's a little bit of real friendship, and I never imagined that I'd be his manager. But he called me up after the now much mythologised 13 hours on the bus from St Kilda to King's Cross, and asked if I wanted to go and have a beer and have a chat, and I came out of a 2-hour chat in the local pub as his manager. And that's at the time I remember him. I said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "I saved up $1,500 and I'm going to make an acoustic single." And I said, "With all due respects, that's probably not one of your greatest ideas. There's not a huge queue forming for that," and because he didn't have a record deal. And I took him back to my house in Bondi, and I played him a solo acoustic albums by Chris Bailey from the Saints and Johnny Thunders. And I said, "I think it would be a good idea if you try and raised a bit more money and made an album." I said, "Then I think people might pay attention." And he did, and that became Post. And then, which didn't sell a lot at the time. I mean, it's like Pieces of the Ark. Everyone claims to have bought it at the time. I know the sales figures. They didn't. And then, Paul decided that he wanted to make a double album. All right, so, here's a guy who's made 3 records and he doesn't have a record deal. And Mushroom really didn't want him as a recording artist. They wanted him as a songwriter. So I was dispatched to go and meet with Michael Gudinski. And Michael Gudinski was always a force of nature, who I love dearly. Michael Gudinski in the 1980s was an unbelievable force of nature. And he enjoyed toying with people like me. And so I had to go in and pitch this idea of a double album. And basically Michael didn't sit down for the whole meeting. He kind of told me I was an idiot, that I was mad, that I should get out of the office. I should get out of the office now. Go away. No, you're completely stupid. No, blah, blah, blah. And so as I was backing out of the office, he said, "I'll give you 60 grand as a publishing advance." I said, "We'll take that." And I said, "If we give you a double album, will you sell it for the price of a single album?" And he was as good as his word. That's how Paul's upward trajectory started, because that Before Too Long, became a semi-hit record.
Yeah, very important part of your career and kind of our listening lives as well. You mentioned something at the beginning that I want to ask you about before we talk about mental health and some of the harder aspects of the working life you've had. You said before that, you've changed your mind over many years, that maybe Fleetwood Mac didn't change, but you changed. Because there was a moment in the book where you talk about Fleetwood Mac being the enemy. It was just the music you would not listen to. You wouldn't be caught dead listening to that music. And I wondered if you could talk about, when people say to you, "Oh, there's no good music anymore," what do you say to them? How do you get people to change their minds and shake things up?
Oh, you tell them to keep listening. Anyone who says, it was all better in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, it was great in all of those eras. But it's as great now as any of those. There's as many good records coming out in 2023 as there were in 1960. I believe that totally. We mythologise those great records of the past, and we don't know how much we'll mythologise the records that have been now in 50 years' time. But
do we mythologise them because of the impact they have on us at that moment? We hear
that has a big part of it,
yeah.
And history will make them bigger than they were. I was reading a book last night. For some reason, I'm reading more about the Eagles than anyone should ever read.
No.
And Mick Wall, who's written this new book about the Eagles, he lists all these cornerstone records in the country rock
area from the 60s and 70s. He said everyone talks about them. No one bought them, no one listened to them. But, they go out to dinner parties and they tell people how much they love them. Their copy's never been on a turntable, but, it's cool to say that you like this. Things change over years. But in my case, getting back to your question, I still find every day something that just new. And it's a particularly great time for Australian music. There is an unbelievable array of great new music that's been made by Australian artists that I will listen to, and I could spend the next hour listing all of these artists that I know about, and I figure if I know about them, I know a bit, but I'm constantly surprised. Someone will say, have you heard this? Have you heard this? Or I'm listening to the radio and I'm going, who's that? And I find out it's some new band from Australia. It's an incredibly vibrant time for music, and just quickly changes. Some years ago, when Fleetwood Mac were coming to Australia, I had some of the hip kids at FBI come in, and they were talking about Fleetwood Mac and how excited they were to go and see the Mac, and how hip they were. And I said, children, sit down. I remember a time, kids, when if you listened to Fleetwood Mac, you did not tell anybody. You did not admit you were expelled from cool class. You may have listened to Fleetwood Mac, you may have loved them, but you told everyone you only listened to Fleetwood Mac when Peter Green was in the band.
Exactly.
None of this cocaine hippie shit in California. Uncool. And look, I talk briefly about how I've changed because, two examples that I give in the book. I couldn't stand Steely Dan in the 70s. I thought it was over-polished garbage. I was a punk rock kid, right? It was the first music revolution. I was born in 56, just like rock and roll, too young for the Beatles. Punk rock, I was there, right? It was LCD sound system, I was there. And I was, and I was buying Pistols records and Clash records and, doing all that sort of stuff. Steely Dan were the enemy.
Yep.
I've grown up. They haven't changed. The records are still exactly the same. I'm now a card-carrying Steely Dan nerd. I read all the books. When I've got time, I listen to the podcast. It's Steely Dan. And the other one is Cold Chisel, because I don't know why, but I didn't get the Cold Chisel gene. I listened to the Tats. I listened to Radio Birdman. I listened to a whole bunch of music, the Divinals, all sorts of things that I loved, in the late 70s, early 80s in Australia, and I didn't get Cold Chisel. And then, there were events in my life, thank you, Susan, where I was, reintroduced and maybe just encouraged to listen more to Don Walker's lyrics and Ian Moss's voice and his guitar playing and what happened when you got all of the Chisel members together. And I had can I call it a midlife epiphany? I don't know, semi-late life, whatever it is. And now, I've been to Barking Spiders shows at the Factory. I've seen a whole bunch of Cold Chisel shows, and I would go tomorrow if there was one. I've seen Don solo, I've seen Mossy solo, and again, it's not like there's nothing different about Cold Chisel. There's nothing different about those records. I'm just listening differently, and writing this book, I went back and listened to a whole bunch of records that I listened to in the early 70s in Launceston. I just wanted to see how they travelled with me. And to my pleasant surprise, the majority of them still sounded pretty good. Some of them sounded as exhilarating, the collection of Jimi Hendrix for, The Who Live at Leeds. Newsflash, Uriah Heep still sound pretty good. That surprised me.
I thought, okay, I'm going back into the heap zone. And I listened to Very Humble, Very Heavy and Salisbury. Now, I cut out at Look at Yourself. This is going into rock nerd territory. That's the one where you look and there's a mirror on the cover. That's where I stopped with the heap. But I did. I had lost those records. I rebought them cheaply and listened to them. You know what? And suddenly I went, and again, it's what you say about music. I put on things like Cricklewood Green by 10 Years After and the Uriah Heep records and Family and Genesis, and I was that kid in 1972 again, sitting in front of my parents' gramophone with a pair of crap headphones on that were destroying my hearing early on, you know, imagining that I was the guy from Uriah Heep. You know, I don't know which one I imagined I was, whether I was Ken Hensley or who, but you know, it was that transportation process. I was that kid again. Yeah. You know, and it was quite remarkable to have that experience.
It's very powerful. Stuart, you are really frank in the book about your experiences of mental ill health, of anxiety, of depression, of agoraphobia, and of addiction. There's a beautiful line one of your friends says to you, you know, I always thought you were an alcoholic, but then I realised you were just sad. And I wondered if you could talk a tiny bit about when did you start to realise that there was something more than just having a lot of big nights? When did you start to realise there was kind of a pattern in your behaviour and then decide that maybe you could do something about it?
It crept up. You know, I think like any addictive behaviour, my friend was right on both counts, I think. Okay. But I started smoking pot as a kid. I didn't drink a lot. I came to Sydney, and we took speed. Then when we earned a little bit more money, we spent $45. You get a tight little bag of cocaine. As you got more money, you got bigger bags of cocaine. And cocaine has one message: take more cocaine. And it's really good at telling you that message. And it's really good at depleting your bank account. And initially I took drugs to write and to stay up and work hard. And then increasingly, over a fairly extended period of time, they became more than that. In the case of drugs, we'll get to alcohol in a minute. In the case of drugs, they started to rule my existence, and I was starting to do things so that I could buy drugs. And another thing that cocaine does is tells you can stay up really late and drink more than you should. And then the alcohol tells you should take more cocaine so that you can keep drinking, and you get into that spiral. Yeah. And I was, in the case of drugs, I was one of those people where it was getting, out of control, and I needed, to stop, and I stopped I stopped in the late 80s. And, my partner was pregnant, and it was kind of pretty obvious that drugs and babies were not going to go together. I'd attempted to have them go together and been fairly unspectacular as a parent in that respect. And this was like, it's time to stop. So, I stopped taking drugs and, haven't taken them since. But I kept on drinking. And I kept on, again, it's hindsight that tells you this stuff. I didn't think my drinking was too bad. I suspect that other people were observing that it was escalating. I'd gone from the couple of beers in the pub, couple of drinks at the record reception, to at times drinking in the morning, drinking to ease hangovers, drinking to, for basically any reason, because I thought, well, this is fun and I'm enjoying this. And I was, to the large part, unaware of what it was doing to me and the impact that it was having. I mean, the person who's in the grip of any sort of addiction is the last person to realise what's going on. Yeah. And people had given me hints, and
suggested that, maybe it was time to slow down. One thing I've learned is, you will ignore all the good advice until you kind of go, okay, it's time to stop. And I didn't, I almost lost my contract to write my Michael Gudinski book because I had a period of drinking excessively and ended up in hospital. Yeah. And the publishers, I remember, were going, they were thinking about withdrawing the contract and wondering whether I was capable of delivering. I was a functioning drinker, the label was running, I was living, some semblance.
You were getting stuff done.
I was getting stuff done, but, again, hindsight, has led me to understand what was going on and what wasn't going on. And so I decided to write the Michael Gudinski book sober, and I did that, and I had great encounters with Michael Gudinski. He kept saying, every time I'd meet him, he'd go, "You still not drinking?" I'd go, "Yep." He'd go, "How do you do it?" And I said, "I'll tell you, Michael." And it's not as simple as I'm going to make. It's a good gag, but I said, "Look, it's really simple, Michael. You just don't drink." And look, and there is part of that, but my stopping drinking was not quite that easy. I had to work at it. I still have to work at it. I'm not tempted, but it's, it comes back all the time. And I, as I think I said to you today, I can easily, in a millisecond, conjure up what it's like after a big night. Yeah. I can just bring that into my psyche. I can bring that feeling of nausea and blah, blah, blah. And I go, phew, I'm glad I'm not there. Yeah. And then after the Michael Gudinski book came out, I drank a little bit more, and then that was not good. And then I stopped, and I haven't had a drink since about October 2015. And I'm, in a fantastic relationship. I'm healthy. And people, and it was only when I stopped that I realised, I started waking up at 5:30 in the morning. I started going, God, someone must be awake for me to annoy. It's 6 o'clock. Who can I call? Exactly. Who can I email? What can I do? And
you detailed that you noticed stuff about your mental health as well. You've had a couple of periods of being really agoraphobic. You couldn't get on the train for 3 stops. You couldn't cross the road.
No,
and you said in the book that somebody suggested something to you that sort of took you out of left field, but it made a difference. What was that?
It was doing an online course that St Vincent's ran because, yes, I was having really, really bad anxiety attacks. And of course, when these things were happening, I thought, I'll just have another drink. That'll fix it. That'll relax me. I won't be anxious. I won't, and then again, it was only hindsight where I realised this was actually making it a lot worse. This was not helping one little bit. But a friend at FBI, he said to me one day, I walked into FBI and he said, "You suffer from anxiety and panic attacks, don't you?" And I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I do too." And he had done. And he, I'd been to doctors and therapists and all sorts of things to try and deal with this. And he just sent me, and he said, "Try this online course." And I went, "An online course?" And I did it. And I completed it, over a couple of months. And I, I look back now and I go, wow, that was me. I mean, there was a couple of years I couldn't walk to the corner store. My home is 5 minutes from here. I couldn't walk around here. And I go, wow, and I still keep vigilance. I'm still uncomfortable in crowds. Yep. Heat and things like that will trigger. But I did learn a great, someone said you can always pick anxiety sufferers in supermarkets. They're the ones holding onto an empty trolley. And I was that person for a couple of years, holding onto something because I thought my legs were going to give way and I was feeling jelly and I needed some security. Yeah. And I'd wander happily around supermarkets for as long as I needed to be there with an empty trolley. Just because I had. So, and then finally, people say to me, "God, you're so productive these days. You've written 6 books. I think it's 6." And I go, "Yeah, and I haven't had a drink for 8 or 9 years. You do the maths. I wouldn't have written this book if I was if I'd kept taking the quantity of drugs I was taking, I wouldn't be alive.
Yeah.
And possibly if I'd kept drinking at the level I was drinking, I wouldn't have been alive either.
Yeah.
So, all of the books are, a fantastic, byproduct of being where I am now, which does not mean I would be moral. There is no moral tone in the book. It's
there's none.
I don't want to say, I had all my fun, don't you do that.
Yeah.
I had my fun and then it got out of control and I had to work out how it was going to change with the help of some really good people.
In one moment, we're going to turn the lights on and it's time for your questions, but I have one more for Stuart. You talk about, there are some fairly tense moments in the book with people who you've had either run-ins with or who were offended by things. And I wondered, has there been any fallout from the book?
Not that I've heard.
Okay.
But they're probably not going to tell me. But look, I didn't write this book to settle scores.
Yeah.
I actually don't dislike that many people.
Yeah.
I had... Every time I kind of veered into that, my partner Susan, who reads everything I write, went, maybe you shouldn't say that. And it was always good advice. And I had a fantastic editor, Patrick Mangan, at Penguin Random House. And he'd just say, hey, I know what you're trying to say, but this could come across as being a little bit arrogant or it's a little bit narky. Can we
tone it down?
Yeah, tone it down. So, I didn't want to write that sort of book. I wanted... I don't like reading those books either.
Yeah.
Unless it's the dirt on the Eagles, and I'm totally there.
You and me both.
Anything about Glenn Fry and Don Henley,
100%.
bring it on.
Yeah.
Don Felder's book is fantastic, by the way, because it's got so much dirt.
I just love in Stuart's book there's a photo of him with Tim Rogers who's wearing the Joe Walsh for president.
Yeah, I went and bought one after I saw his. I got one too.
I want that T-shirt.
Right. You can borrow mine.
Thank you.
But no, there weren't that many legal things that we had to address. There were just a few, inferences that could be misconstrued. But I'm touching wood, Michaela.
Yeah.
But I don't oh God, there could be famous last words. I don't expect outfall. I was careful to be protective of relationships in the past. I wrote this book a lot for my children, for them to understand maybe stuff that I probably could have told them more of in person, at various times.
And you said before tonight that when your children read the book, they kind of went, now I know what you were doing.
One of them's read it so far. Yeah, they've all got it. And my daughter Jay sent me a very nice message saying how much she loved it. She said, what an interesting life you've had. Now, if I'd been a better dad, she would have known most of that already. Right? But anyhow.
But I wonder if you could have done both. I mean, it's a hard thing to say. Well, and maybe not true, but...
Well, I think one of the downsides of having the sort of personality I have, but combining it with drugs and alcohol, is you can become too singular for your own good. They say these things are social lubricants and all that sort of stuff, but they can also bring you so completely inward, and they can make you, very self-obsessed and very. Just read about the Eagles, but they, I didn't get anywhere near as bad as Don Henley on every level, thank goodness. But no, they can cocoon you to the point where you are oblivious to some other things, and I worked ferociously for a long time, and again, I keep mentioning hindsight. You can't go back, but if I could, I might have not worked quite as hard at certain times, and I might have done some other things differently.
Yeah. I want to have time for your questions, so we're going to turn the lights up, and we've got a roving microphone. Hayley's going to be around with the microphone, so if you have a question for Stuart, we would love to hear from you. Sure. Just in the middle, we'll just bring you the mic, and then down the front, Hayley, as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Hey, Stuart. You regularly talk about your love of crime fiction. Did you get to interview or tour any of your crime fiction heroes?
I brought James Ellroy to Australia for a national tour, and the book does contain the kind of hysterical night we spent having dinner at Bob Carr's place, but we won't go there. But it's in the book. I did one of the things I'm most proud of was a night I put together when Elmore Leonard was in Australia, and he was promoting Pronto, which was what Justified, the TV series, kind of evolved into, and I put on I called it a night of crime and country at Kinsella's, and I had a DJ playing crime-related country songs, and I put together a band, and I asked them to learn every song that Elmore Leonard had referred to in the book, but I didn't tell Elmore. And we were about 15 minutes into their set when he looked and he went, I get it. That's what you've done. I did some stuff with Lawrence Block when he was here, with Michael Connolly, Walter Mosley, Ken Bruin, who I love, the Irish writer, and I interviewed a lot of them. I did some conferences with P.D. James, who I absolutely adored, and so interviewed a lot. But the moment I say this, Jimmy, I'm going to forget something. But the only tour I did with a crime writer, at the launch of Mean Streets, Andrew Vax and Ed McBain read alongside a bunch of Australians. Steve Wright, Morel Day, Peter Corris, if I remember correctly. See, I've drunk a lot and taken a lot of drugs, but my memory's not bad. But yeah, Elroy was the only tour, and that was a big extravaganza. He insisted that we show a documentary about him. We had a band playing. He came out and did James Ellroy's version of a rap. It was big. It went for hours. That did all right. We didn't make any money, but we kind of didn't lose very much.
There's another question just down the front, Haley. Thanks very much.
It's all right. Oh, that's what you like to say.
Did you run into Paul Keating while he was in the music scene, managing performers at all? Across paths? Yeah.
No, I'm. Thanks very much, but I'm too young to have been. The Ramrods were a little before my time.
Kinky Friedman?
Kinky. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, I toured Kinky more times than I should have done.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's a bit on the right.
He's annoying. Oh, his politics are incredibly terrible. Him and Piers Ackerman sitting together. It's just like I'm going. What am I doing in this?
But there's no question all the way.
I did ask Paul Keating. Sorry to interrupt. I did write to Paul Keating asking whether he would be interviewed for my Roadies book, and he declined. I have the letter on my wall.
I love it. So, question down the back.
Yes, Stuart, you mentioned that actually I can relate to this very much myself too. Some music that you first heard many decades ago now sounds a lot better than it did all those decades ago, and some music now doesn't sound as good as it did back then. You mentioned several examples of music which now sounds a lot better than it did back then. I was wondering if you would care to mention maybe any ones which don't sound as good as they did back then.
Very diplomatic, very.
They don't sound as good. I was surprised that there wasn't very much that I didn't respond to, where I went, what was I thinking? I love English, Scottish and Irish folk music because I grew up listening to a lot of it. Some of the peripheral folk figures were a little bit tame for my tastes at the time, or these days. But for the most part, I went, wow, these are, and I'm talking listening to Tiernan Nog and the Watersons and all that sort of stuff. And I thought these records have stood the test of time.
really well. I'm trying to think. It's a good question, and maybe it'll come to me and I'll tell you afterwards. But I don't recall anything where I went, what in heaven's name were you thinking? Maybe I had good taste, or maybe my memory remembers that time and that era of music. Some of the prog rock, was, but then again, I can go into a prog rock zone really quickly, and we're there, and it's all good. So probably not that much, not as much as I expected.
Thank you. Hayley, there's a question down here in the second row. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart, it can be very hard to interview people who you really, really admire. Have you ever found yourself interviewing somebody and then your sense of them has changed completely so that you can't listen to their music in the same way again?
Yeah, Tom Waits. I interviewed Tom Waits twice, the 2 times that he's come to Australia. And the first time was fine. Tom was pretending to be a beatnik, and he was all right. We did things that, you probably wouldn't be able to do now. The late Andrew McMillan, not the Australian Andrew McMillan, and I took Tom Waits walking through King's Cross, in the early evening, and he was good. The second time was I didn't listen to Tom Waits for 15 years after this encounter, and I still can't listen to him without thinking. I had an interview with him, and a good friend of mine, Suzanne Dowling, who was a presenter at Double J and went on to be on television, she was a rabid Tom Waits fan, and she didn't get the Double J interview. So we were buddies, and I said, "Well, come along, sit in on my interview. I don't care, you want to meet Tom. Let's do this." So we went up to the Siebel Townhouse, and Tom was still being a pretend beatnik, and he was drinking. He had a bottle of red wine. It was like mid-morning, and every question I asked him, it was like probably the greatest intellect of the 20th century was in the room. That was meant to be me. And I wasn't asking particularly interesting questions. I was just doing standard stuff. And then when Suzanne asked a question, he was beyond belittling and nasty and patronising. He was just hideous. And then I'd asked another question, and the great intellect of the 20th century was in the room, and she would ask another question. We both should have walked out. He was a truly appalling human being. It was an unacceptable way to treat anybody. And so, at the end of that, it was 15, maybe 20 years before I would listen to Tom Waits records. And I still can't listen to them without thinking about that. That's ingrained in my psyche. And I thought, was it a persona? And even if it was a persona, that's still, you don't have license to treat another human being, who might just be a woman as well, who was asking really, really good questions with such disdain and such disregard, and especially pitting them against the guy. And I lost, I was a big Tom Waits fan prior to that. And under sufferance, I will from time to time listen to Tom Waits records, and I'll still go, God, you're a prick.
Yeah. Wowzers. We've got time for one more, and then you can chat to Stuart. We'll go up the back.
Can we do 2?
We'll do 2, yeah.
Stuart, when you were writing for RAM, I was in boarding school on the Darling Downs in Queensland, and we couldn't hear the music that you were writing about. And I would read about Radio Birdman,
all right.
and I was like, I imagined them, and by the time I got to Sydney, they'd broken up, so I didn't get to see them. And I got to hear some of the music, but by the time I actually got to hear them in 2015, they were just as good as you'd written about them, as I'd imagined in my head from reading your writing. I felt like I hadn't missed anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was very good. Thank you.
And just on Radio Birdman, I mean, they were again at I didn't see them in Sydney at the time. I saw them when they came to Adelaide. I was completely in awe of them. The first time I met Dennis Tech and Rob Young, it was like, I am not worthy, you know. I'm still a little bit like that, even though I know them both pretty well. But, you know, Radio Birdman in that era were just unbelievable. You know, it's like, sorry if I sound like fanboy, but I was, you know, there's those moments we talk about where you're just going, how goddamn good is, I mean, how exhilarating and thrilling is this? And you're right, they've continued over the years to still, you know, have that presence and that's something that when you get those five guys together, they just make this astonishingly magnificent noise, and I love it.
I also love your point, because for a lot of people, you don't get to hear the music. Either you don't have access to it, or it just didn't happen in your generation. Or I remember in the 90s and before that, hearing musicians say, it's, you know, this terrible, sad thing that people, they read about music before they hear the music. But you describe how important it is to read about the music, because that's a huge part of how we find new things. Last question over here.
I've had a chunk of my life roadieing, and I'm just wondering what two stories didn't appear in your book.
In the Roadies book or in this book?
In the Roadies book.
Probably lots. The
Roadies
was fantastic. I mean, the writing about Roadies was probably, you know, I loved writing Shake Some Action, even though I never intended that I would write a memoir. But I loved writing about roadies. It was one of the greatest couple of years of my life. I didn't want it to end. I just wanted to keep talking to roadies, you know. And I remember speaking to the Tony Soprano in the nicest possible sense of roadies, Howard Freeman. And Howard said, you know, have you finished? He said, how are you going? And I said, I'm done. You know, I've interviewed 80 roadies. And he said, have you interviewed Kerry Cunningham yet? And I said, no. He said, you're not finished. And Kerry Cunningham, the chapter is called Kerry fucking Cunningham. He didn't know I'd called it that until I ran into him. I was a little nervous. No, I started writing that book because of mental health things. You know, I was told that, you know, Australian road crew have 5 times the national suicide rate, which is an appalling, horrible statistic and one that's not reflected around the world. When I was told that, I wanted to know why. Because on a superficial level, the life of a roadie, you know, you're travelling, you're doing, you know, you're around rock and roll bands, you're doing all that sort of stuff. So that was why I started to write that book. And I just met some of the most magnificent human beings that I've ever encountered. You know, I wanted to also negate that belief that, you know, oh, they're just, you know, and they push this and all that, you know, and like anyone who sets up that equipment. And, you know, I remember one night when I was down in Wollongong watching an Elton John show, and because I wanted to see the crew and I wanted to see the breakdown at the night, and I was there about midnight, and they were, you know, they had 26 semi-trailers. They had to be packed that night to be on the road, to go to Melbourne, to get on the boat, to get to Hobart. You know, and someone had to know where every bit of that equipment, there were another 26 that didn't have to leave that night. You know, you'd know all about this, right? And I remember I was standing in the darkness, and there was an older roadie, and I never got his name, and I wish I did, but he just came up and stood next to me and knew what I was doing. He said, Stuart, this is what we do. He just said very quietly, he said, we build pyramids and then we take them down and then we rebuild them somewhere else. And I thought, wow, you know, it was just mind-blowing. So I was completely overwhelmed, because when the book came out, Howard Freeman had seen his chapter, and Tana Douglas, the world's first female roadie, had seen hers. None of the others had, and I've never been a roadie. And I was really nervous about how they would respond. And I had the best publicists that you could ever get for a book like that, and that was roadies. And they responded to it really well. They were moved by it, which I was flattered by.
And a couple of them, one of them rang up and said, now I can explain to my kids where I was all those years. A few of them said they wished their parents had been alive to read the book to understand what they do. So and incidentally, it's the best-selling of all of the books that I've ever written, and I'm really happy about that too. Thank you.
I'm going to do a few things in reverse. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We have gone a little bit over. In a moment, Ed Barnes is going to be back on the stage. And while he's here, you're welcome to grab a drink and have a book signed by Stuart. You can buy a bouquet of Stuart books up the back from that beautiful Berkshire Books Leichhardt, and he'll be signing them as well. I want to let you all know quickly that September 26th is actor Heather Mitchell here at talking about her memoir, Everything and Nothing. October 26th here is Robin Davidson, the author of Tracks, talking about her memoir. And then in November, on the 23rd, we have Charlotte Wood talking about her new work of fiction, Stoneyard Devotional. But I wanted to say thank you, Stuart, so much for telling us about your mind-blowing adventures in music, in promoting, in writing, in publicising, and in life. Please join me in thanking Stuart Coupe.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Michaela.
And we're going to invite Ed.